The New York Times, on the 25th of March, 1887, made note of an unexpected ship being overdue. Quote, "The steamship Scotia of the Fabre Line, due here from Mediterranean ports over a week ago, has not been heard from since she left Gibraltar on February 27th. She had on board from 800 to 1,000 passengers, of whom a large number originally sailed on the steamship Burgundia, which was beached near Naples after having been run into by the Italian man-of-war Italia some weeks ago."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Unlucky Passengers of the Scotia.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Scotia was a screw-propelled iron-hulled steamship built in Leith, Scotland in 1881 for the Fabre Line. The 2,492-ton ship, like many other ships of her era, was designed to carry a large number of passengers, immigrants who were traveling from Europe to North or South America. At one time or another, the Scotia had been on both routes, taking passengers from France to either New York or to ports in South America before being placed instead on a route from the Mediterranean to Buenos Aires. To take passengers from the coast of Italy to New York, as she had on this voyage, was unusual for her, but so were the circumstances in which she had picked them up. The 835 passengers on board the Scotia had begun their voyage on the 14th of February, 1887, aboard a different Fabre steamship, the Burgundia, which generally ran the route between various Mediterranean ports and New York, as the Burgundia had been departing from the port of Naples when she had been struck amidships on her starboard by the Italian man-of-war Italia. With her main and aft holds quickly filling with water, the Burgundia had been run ashore to prevent her from sinking. She would be repaired and refloated, but for the time being, her passengers, mainly women and children since there was a large number of families on board, were stranded in Naples. The Fabre Line dispatched the Scotia from Marseille on the 20th of February to pick up passengers and cargo in Naples. On the 23rd of February, the Scotia departed from Naples with a very small passenger list and an unusually small cargo of 200 tons of fruit and wine, when she normally would have carried 1,500 or 2,000 tons of cargo. She was soon told to turn around and pick up the people stranded from the Burgundia, in addition to the passengers that she had on board. The 835 passengers from the Burgundia, plus the passengers that she already had on board, brought her total passengers to an estimated 1,000, though it may have been as high as 1,200, as well as a crew of 42 under the command of Captain Ruffat. It was later claimed that she had not been provisioned with enough food to reflect the vast difference in passenger numbers between her first and second departure from Naples. The crossing of Scotia was anything but smooth, as reflected by her delayed arrival off of the coast of the United States. For the first 10 days, everything was well. The Scotia had gone from having very few passengers to having almost more than she could carry, but since they were traveling in warmer climates, the passengers were able to spend much of their day on the deck, making the voyage not an entirely unpleasant one. Unfortunately, this would be followed by 10 days of misery. The weather turned foul and waves began to crash over the deck of the Scotia. The passengers of the Scotia, who had up until this point had not felt so cramped thanks to the freedom of the deck, were now confined below, without even a good supply of fresh air since all of the hatches and skylights were securely battened down so no water could enter. As the waves struck the ship, those below decks were thrown around with enough force that most of them were bruised or cut, and some of them experienced even more serious injuries. Food supplies also began to be rationed, since the ship's progress was dramatically slowed by the storms, with no one getting as much as they would have liked. In spite of 10 days of violent storms, there was no alarm about whether or not the Scotia could hold her own. She had the highest rating from Lloyd's, and she was considered to be a well-built and sturdy vessel. Captain Rafat was also considered an experienced sailor, having previously served in the French Navy. Things might have been unpleasant on board, but the feeling on board was still one of confidence that they would reach their destination. After 10 days, however, the engines of the ship began to reflect the strain that battling the storms had put on them. Captain Rafat gave the order that the engines should no longer be put under such strain, out of fear that they would stop working entirely. For now, the engines should be kept working to such an extent that they could maintain headway, but no more than that, for the rest of the voyage. The Scotia was to be at half speed. The Scotia was now 8 days overdue, and food had also run out. For the first time on the voyage, passengers who were still trapped under the deck of the ship were not given any food at all. It does not seem to have occurred to the crew to dip into any of the cargo of fruit and wine for humanitarian purposes. Captain Rafat was not able to determine the position of his ship for 3 days straight as they neared the coast of the United States. Not only that, but the meager cargo compared to what the ship was intended to carry meant that she was too light, and Captain Rafat would later complain that she was not responding properly to her rudder. Captain Rafat also does not seem to have realized how far his ship was being dragged to the lee due to her lower engine power and light load. Unable to take any reckonings, when he saw a light, he assumed it was the Shinnecock Light and changed his ship's course accordingly to west-southwest. Unfortunately, what he had seen was instead the Fire Island Light. He was off his reckoning by about 50 miles. Captain Rafat would later say that, in spite of trying to change his ship's course, his ship had not obeyed. Initial reports would say that the ship's engine had finally given out, and that the ship had been beached to save her. But Captain Rafat dismissed these rumors and said the ship's machinery had still been fine. The reason for the grounding was that the storm was blowing them on shore, and they were caught in a northerly current. When the ship fell into a trough in the sea, it was all over. At around 4 a.m. on the 25th of March, the Scotia grounded on the outer bar of Long Island Beach near Blue Point Life Saving Station. She struck with enough force that both iron masts immediately came crashing down, taking some of her bulwarks with them. The Scotia's nose was driven into the sand until she was over the outer bar, and she settled broadside in between 2 sandbars, rocking in a way that the New York Times described as being cradle-like. Local sailors immediately called into question Captain Rafat's story. They pointed out that Shinnecock Light was a steady light, while the Fire Island Light was a flashing light. It would have been impossible for the two lights to have been confused by any captain who knew anything about the route. Not only that, but a sailor who had spent much of his life living and sailing in the region stated that he had never encountered a northerly current in that area. The current had always passed along the shore instead of towards it, even during storms. Still, the Fabre agents were quick to state that they absolved Captain Rafat of any wrongdoing, that the wreck was entirely beyond his control. The Fabre agents were about to have their own difficulties. The United States inspectors of foreign steam vessels heard with some surprise that the Burgundia had been initially headed in their direction with 800 passengers. According to United States laws, she was only permitted to carry 454. Not only that, but the Scotia was not allowed to bring passengers into New York at all. The Scotia had been inspected in 1885 and was allowed to carry 486 passengers, but this certificate had run out in August of 1886 and had not been renewed. Not only that, but she had only 530 life preservers on board. Only about half of what she would need to equip those on board of her, which was also against regulations. There would soon be a discussion about more firmly enforcing the regulations that were supposed to govern ships bringing passengers into New York City. Fortunately for those on the Scotia, they were not forced to don the insufficient life preservers. Almost as soon as the Scotia had come to grief, they had been spotted by Captain Jones and the crew of the Blue Point Life-Saving Station. Concerned that if the waves kept battering the Scotia, she would go to pieces, the lifeboat crew repeatedly tried to launch the lifeboat, but were repeatedly driven back, so they turned to the idea of firing a lifeline. They succeeded in getting a lead line to the ship, but this required that the crew of the Scotia haul on it so that they could get the larger and more useful rope to them. Though the life-saving crew spent an hour signaling to the crew of the ship, all standard signals that crews were supposed to be trained on, no one took up the lead line. Fortunately, the weather moderated enough that the life-saving crew was able to row out to the Scotia, where they boarded the stricken steamer and hauled in their own lifeline. With this, they were able to set up life cars and breeches buoys to begin bringing the passengers to shore. The first passenger in the life car was Giorgio Farina, who was originally a passenger on the Burgundia. They were originally going to evacuate the women and children first, so Captain Ruffat tried to order him out of the car, but Farina refused. He had clearly had enough of the ship as a whole, and deciding that it was not the time or place to use force, he was allowed to depart from the Scotia. While most of the people who were taken from the ship huddled on the beach, Farina made his way to Patagog railway station, where he appealed to the conductor for a free ride and arrived in New York, where he was soon surrounded by people wanting to know his story. Meanwhile, the evacuation continued until 60 of the women on board had been removed from the ship, but the lifesavers then received a telegram from the Fabre Company to stop all evacuation until relief ships that they were sending could arrive. The people who were already on the beach were cared for by the local residents of Patagog until they could be sent on to New York. The United States Revenue Cutter Grant came to anchor near the Scotia and began to unload passengers and what luggage could be found, as did a couple of barges sent by the Fabre Line. Eventually, all of the passengers were safely on shore, though the crew declared that they would remain with the ship unless there seemed as though there was a real danger of her going to pieces. Captain Ruffat still hoped that his ship could be saved, even though all of the newspapers declared that it was impossible, and that the ship was doomed. Those reporters who visited the ship declared that after 10 days of people being trapped below decks in such crowded conditions, the vilest Mott Street tenement would seem heavenly by comparison, and there seemed to be some question as to why anyone would desire to stay on such a ship for long, but the crew was determined. The Italian immigrants that were taken from the Scotia had mostly lost everything. They were brought to Castle Garden, which was at the time the central processing place for immigrants. When the luggage was retrieved, it was brought to Castle Garden to find its owner, but in desperation, many people would all claim it, and a system had to be put in place where a trunk was only handed over if someone could prove they had a key that worked in the lock. Most of the people who had been on board the Scotia would never see their belongings again, leaving them completely penniless. Farina had happily told reporters that he had friends who would take care of him in New York until he could find his feet, but many were not so lucky, and unlike many shipwrecks, there would be no public subscriptions or outpouring of public support for the victims of the Scotia. This is most likely explained by the openly derogatory headline that declared that this was the second wreck for 1,000 Oregon grinders. The Italian immigrants were simply not very welcome, and no one seemed to step up to help them. One man who had been on the wreck, named Giovanni Romero, had, in his desperation to find work, fallen for a scam. He had paid a man $2 to find him work, only to be kicked off of the job almost immediately. He had gone back to get his $2 back, only to be violently attacked. It was a common scam targeting immigrants at the time, but new to New York, Romero was not to know to be aware of it. Romero went and reported the matter to the police, and the man he accused of scamming him was held on a $500 bond, but Romero was also sent to the house of detention. He was still lucky to have survived the ordeal. The Scotia had cost of life. Niccolò Gioia, a young man who had been on the Scotia, passed away in the Castle Garden Hospital. The mixture of starvation and trauma of the wreck had been too much for him. Amazingly, the Scotia would be refloated. It took a month of work, with newspapers reporting if she had even been moved 6 feet, since that was more than anyone had expected. The bad weather that had battered the ship seemed to stop almost as soon as she had wrecked, giving the people salvaging her a chance before she went to pieces. She was towed to Merritt Wrecking Dock, where she would be repaired, but she would not continue under the ownership of the Fabre Line. She would be sold immediately and renamed the Mars, under which name she would sail until she wrecked permanently in 1889, though we could find no further details of this fate. For those who had sailed as passengers on her last voyage, it was almost certainly a relief that they would never again have to hear the name of the Fabres, Scotia, ever again. For more information, please see the New York Times from March 26, 1887, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.